Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 15 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded in past years. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in years to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name is Jack Newton, and I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960. I served as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences for more than 20 years. And I worked closely with Paul Borghi in the development of his original interview series. I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. Our guest today is Dr. Otto Bauer, who's currently a professor of speech communication and who for a number of years, from 1979 through 1994, was Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Otto, we've known each other for a long time, and I know what a Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs is because you were my boss for a number of years. But I'm sure that many of our listening audience don't have any idea of what that title means. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about what a Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs does?
Well, I'll try. Of course, it is different on campuses, other campuses. Everyone doesn't do it the same way. Mm-hmm. But for me, the principal activities that we had on campus here in Academic Affairs involved academic programming, academic budgeting, and personnel decisions. When I first arrived here, there were people assigned in each of these categories already doing their jobs. So it was a pleasure to step in and have these things underway when I got here. But those are the three main activities.
Okay. Now, I have to tell you, we've known each other for a long time, and you're a speech professor, and I feel just a little bit intimidating here to be talking. I kind of get the feeling that maybe you're evaluating me as a you're not going to give me a grade at the end of this, are you, Otto?
I have a feeling about myself as well as about others, and that is we all do the best we can. Good. And I really believe that.
Well, I'll try and do the best I can in this interview today. As I said, we've known each other for a long time. I've known a lot about you because I was on the search committee that helped bring you here to the university many years ago. But I don't think we've really had a chance ever to talk a whole lot about how you got about your background, how you got started in all of this. Well, maybe we could go back as far as you'd like. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Elgin, Illinois, and went to Sheridan Grade School and then went to Elgin High School.
Now, where in Illinois is Elgin?
It's about 30 to 40 miles west of Chicago.
Okay.
In fact, I was just back to Elgin in September for the 50th, that's 5-0, the 50th class reunion of my high school graduation. Wow. I graduated in 1949 and went to Northwestern University on a 4-year debate scholarship and stayed there for my graduate study as well. But something kind of interesting, in 1949, believe it or not, Northwestern University was still playing football with leather helmets.
I can believe that, yeah. Leather helmets.
I remember when they played Michigan, they had these fancy, hard-hitting helmets. We all thought this was grossly unfair to have to play a team with these weapons that they called helmets.
So you started out in speech communication at Northwestern.
Right.
How did you happen to pick that field?
Well, it started in grade school when my next-door neighbor, Virginia Landwehr, her name is, she later became Dean of Students at Northwestern University. When my next-door neighbor and I were entered in the grade school city debate tournament, and we won that tournament. So when I went to high school, I already had some notions about speech communication and about debate, but Elgin is such a basketball-crazy town that I thought I had to try to play basketball first. So my first 2 years in high school I spent in basketball and not in debate. And starting my junior year, the debate coach contacted me and asked me to come out for the debate team. It's the best thing I ever did in terms of my future education, because it prepared me for the opportunity to have a scholarship in debate at Northwestern. And that was a real turning point. You know, it led me into speech communication and all the associated activities.
So you finished a bachelor's degree at Northwestern.
Right.
What year was that?
1953.
53, okay.
I was one of those persons who actually made it through
finished in 4 years.
That's
Well,
right.
Congratulations on that accomplishment.
Right.
And then did you go directly into graduate school?
Yes. Went into graduate study right away. I was also in the Air Force ROTC program. I started that at Northwestern in my junior year when it first arrived on campus. And at that time it was a 4-year program. And so my first 2 years were my junior and senior year, my first 2 years of ROTC. And then the second 2 years I picked up as a graduate student. So I was studying, you know, along with my graduate study and coaching debate. I was a coach then for the next couple of years. Then I also prepared, you know.
Sure.
I lost track of my train of thought or what I was preparing for at that time.
So so then you're in graduate school at Northwestern.
Right.
And finishing up the last 2 years of Air Force ROTC.
Right.
And then you...
Then I had to make a decision about pilot training. Because in those days they gave you a physical examination and classified you according to your physical. If you were physically qualified for flight, then you either flew or you got out of the Air Force ROTC. And if you were qualified for navigator training, you were a navigator. And if you weren't qualified for either of those, you had a commission in the reserves, more in the National Guard than in the regular reserves. I qualified for flight training, so I went into flight training.
So this is after you finished your doctoral degree?
No, I had finished my coursework and my examinations, and I still had to complete the dissertation when I went into pilot training.
Ah, okay.
So for 3 years, my first year was in flight school, and then the next 2 years was a regular flying assignment out of Waco, Texas.
So you went into the Air Force before you finished your doctorate, and this was you were on active duty full time in the Air Force.
Right, and it took me 3 years while I was on active duty to complete the dissertation.
Well, so you were doing two things at once. You were doing a dissertation and serving on active duty as an Air Force officer, and learning to be a pilot at the same time.
And I didn't have a science background. I had a humanities background, social science background. So everything we did in pilot training was new to me. You know, studying hydraulics, studying some engineering, studying weather, and navigation, and so forth was all new to me. I can recall the physical education instructor we had there for physical training, Coach. You know, he turned us into physical specimens whether we wanted to be one or not. And he said to us when we first started training, he said, "You're going to wake up in the morning and you're not going to say, 'Do I solo today?' You're going to wake up in the morning and say, 'Do I have PT today?'" And he was absolutely right. I never was in better physical condition than I was when I was in pilot training.
Well, now, this was the mid-1950s. Was this during the time of the Korean War? Were you...
No, I was one of those persons who came into the service in between. I was in from 1956 to 1961. So I was after the Korean War and before the Vietnam War. And so when they ask me to fill out these forms, they say, "Are you a veteran?" I have to say, no, I'm not a veteran, even though I spent over 5 years as a pilot in the Air Force.
So you did lots of flying, but not in combat.
I had no one shooting at me, and I think that was very fortunate.
So then what? When did you finished your dissertation? I presume then you got your doctoral degree.
Right. It might be interesting. When I was working on my dissertation in the final days of preparation, I asked if I could go on ground duty, the briefing duty, for the last month, because that was that final push to get the degree finished. And so I would come into the flight room and brief the navigators and prepare the aircraft briefings and so forth, and people would have their missions, and I would sit and type on my dissertation in the office. And I had one of the majors come up to me. I won't say his name. One of the majors came up to me and said, "Otto, what in the world are you doing?" I said, "I'm working on a dissertation. I'm getting my PhD at Northwestern University." He said, "Well, you know, I've got a neighbor who's getting a doctorate at an institution, and he's not going through all that." I said, "Oh, really? What's he doing?" He said, "Well, he told me that he has visited quite a few libraries in the neighborhood, and there's all kinds of dissertations available." And he apparently, this other person, was just submitting a dissertation that someone else had written. And as soon as I heard this, I said, "You know, Major, I really don't care to discuss this with you anymore. It makes me seem like I'm kind of on a futile activity here. But I'm on what I believe to be the proper road."
I probably shouldn't say this, but this knowledge that dissertations could be written this way may have served you in good stead later on when you became a Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs.
We may get into that later on in our discussion, but it certainly did.
But right now we're finishing up your dissertation and you're getting your PhD, and I presume you got it what year?
1959.
59.
August 59.
Good. And then after that what?
Then when I first went into the Air Force, I made application to teach at the Air Force Academy. And they said, "We will put you on active file, but the first priorities in the Air Force are pilot training." And when I finished pilot training, I called the Air Force Academy and said, I'm on active file, supposedly. I just finished my pilot training. And they said, "Well, the most important priority in the Air Force is regular flying duty. So after you've had at least 2 years of regular flying duty, then we'll consider bringing you to the Air Force Academy." So I flew aircraft for 2 years.
What did you fly? What type of aircraft?
Well, there was only one class after mine that was in multi-engine reciprocating engines, because after my class, which was 57U, after the 57V, the next classes were all jet training. So I did not have jet training. I had reciprocal training, multi-engine. So I flew B-25s. I had about 750 hours in B-25, and I had another 800 or 1,000 hours in T-29s, which is a Convair. Convair was the twin engine that the airlines used for all their short hops in those days. And when I flew the B-25, we were training radar intercept. That is, people to identify aircraft by flying up alongside of them, or firing passes where we would fly through the aircraft, underneath the aircraft. And when I went to T-29s, which was the next year, we were training navigators and bombardiers. And the T-29 was such a more sophisticated aircraft than the B-25 that I thought I was in heaven flying the T-29. It was just marvelous aircraft. And I have over 2,000 hours of flying time.
So that, so after you finished this flight time, why then you got an Air Force Academy appointment? Or
Right.
was that as a civilian, or were you still in the?
No, I was still in the military. In fact, that was one of the conditions. When I went into the military, I went in on a 3-year contract, and my appointment would expire at the end of 3 years. And they said, well, we're not bringing you to the Air Force Academy unless you're willing to sign an indefinite statement. So I had to, in order to go to the academy to teach, I had to sign an indefinite statement. So I became a reserve officer without a date of termination.
And how long did you teach at the academy?
I taught at the academy for 2 years.
And you were teaching then speech classes?
No, I didn't teach a single speech class
No.
while I was there. They brought me into the English department, and I would teach 3 sections of English composition each semester. We would teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. So we had...
I remember when I was an undergraduate, we had that same kind of schedule.
We went through 6 days.
That's a lot of work.
And then I would do my flying on the side.
Yeah.
In order to get my flight pay. Now
How long did you do that, Otto? How many?
I did that for 2 years at the Air Force Academy.
Yeah. And then what? And then?
Well, something I have to brag for just half a second here. When I was in pilot training, I graduated first in my class in transition flying, which is takeoffs and landings. That's rather important.
Yes.
So I was proud of that. But I also knew that when I flew down in Waco 90 hours a month, and then got to the Air Force Academy and flew 4 hours for pay or 8 hours for proficiency, I knew the difference between 8 and 90 was an awful lot of time spent in the classroom and grading themes and not in an airplane developing proficiency in flying. So after I left the service in 1961, I have not signed a clearance since then in flying, because I know I would probably be in an accident trying to find a place to happen. And you have to be proficient in these jobs like that to sustain them.
Right.
But no, after the Air Force Academy, I went to Bowling Green State University.
That's in Ohio.
In Ohio.
Right.
It's in northwestern Ohio, just about 15 miles south of Toledo.
Now, is that when you first started your career in teaching speech, or you weren't teaching English at Bowling Green?
No, I hadn't taught English anywhere before the Air Force Academy. And so I think that I really learned my grammar, my writing, and grading the first set of themes.
And so how many years were you at Bowling Green?
I was 10 years at Bowling Green.
10 years?
Right.
So I
went through the ranks there. I had been an assistant professor of English. I had to go back to an instructor of speech at Bowling Green. But the salaries were very good. And I remember calling my major professor and saying, should I go to Bowling Green or somewhere else where I can be an assistant professor? But they insist on everyone starting at the beginning, instructor. And he said, you don't eat rank. And so I said, fine, I went to Bowling Green and never regretted going to Bowling Green. It was a fine university.
10 years is quite a while.
Right.
But you did leave there after 10 years.
Right. At Bowling Green, as I say, I went from instructor through full professor in terms of rank. And I also had been coaching debate. See, I coached debate at Northwestern. I coached it at the Air Force Academy. The first victories over Annapolis and West Point were not in football and basketball. They were in debate.
Good for you.
After that, I coached debate for 3 years at Bowling Green. But then I started doing other administrative activities. I started as a director of graduate admissions and fellowships, and then became an assistant dean in the graduate college, and then had an internship sponsored by the American Council on Education. They called ACE Fellows is what they called us.
That's to kind of help you learn to be an administrator on the job, as it were.
Yes. and the institution that I was fortunate enough to be assigned to was the University of California at Berkeley. And so,
this was what year
of those 10 years, the year 1969-70, I spent on the Berkeley campus.
Those were pretty. I'm trying to find the right word for it. Disruptive years, turbulent years.
Very turbulent, very
the
disruptive.
The late 60s, yes.
Very exciting, also. In fact, during the last, the Vice Chancellor called me in toward the end of the year and said that the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs hadn't had a leave in 2 years because there had been this People's Park problem in the previous year, and he had had a leave for 2 years, and they were going to give him 2 months off. He was going to follow Alexander's path in reverse through Africa in his studies. He was a classical, he was a classicist from Harvard, marvelous person. But anyway, they said, while he's gone, we think a fitting termination to your internship here would be for you to fill in as acting Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs for the 2 months that he's gone. And I thought this would be really a very good experience. And it was a good experience, but it was a rather traumatizing experience because 2 weeks after I started in that job, which was just about, I started April 1, and by April 15, the campus almost blew up.
I would guess that we could spend the rest of the hour just talking about your experiences in California during those few months.
It was exciting.
But I guess maybe we better move on because we want to get to your experiences here at UNO as well. So you had that year's internship in California, and then you did you go back to Bowling Green?
Came back. You were obligated to return to your institution, your original institution, for at least a year. So I returned there for a year, where, by the way, we had another whole round of disruptions that were...
But you're an old hand at that now.
I was an old hand at it by then. And after that, I went to the University of Wisconsin, the Parkside campus, which was a new campus in the Wisconsin system. That was my first assignment as a Vice Chancellor.
So how did you happen to move from Bowling Green to Parkside? Was this, did you apply for a job there, or did they come and get you, or what was the...
I was kind of, looking at the want ads, and I applied for the position at...
It must have been pretty exciting with a brand new institution.
Yes, it was, and it was in particular because the Vice Chancellor that I followed on that campus had only been there for about 2 years. It might even have only been 1 year because he got into difficulty right away with developing what he called instant greatness. And instant greatness was sitting down with all the faculty files and putting them into stacks. One stack, these people go, another one, these stay, another stack, I don't know.
Well, is this good to...
Well, he found himself in the stack that said, you go. Is what happened.
So he left and you moved in.
So the position was vacant for about 3/4 of a year when I moved in. And I mention this because this is the dramatic difference there was between coming to UNO and going to the Wisconsin Parkside campus. That is, on the Wisconsin Parkside campus, there was a level of distrust and anger between administrators and faculty.
I know some of the things that went on there, and you know how I know them? Because I read your book.
Oh, yeah.
And, I should have asked you to bring a copy of that with you so that we could have the camera focus on it and show everybody the title of it. I really love that title. Could you tell us what it is?
Lower Moments in Higher Education.
Lower Moments in Higher Education. Your experiences at the Wisconsin system.
My experiences in the Wisconsin system, at Berkeley, at Bowling Green, at UNO.
So we'll invite, rather than go into the detail of all of those sometimes hilarious exploits there, and sometimes rather sad exploits, Rather than do that, we'll invite our audience to go to the library and get a copy of your book, Lower Moments in Higher Education, and find out all about what went on there.
Or even better, go to the bookstore or Borders or Barnes & Noble and buy a copy.
Buy a copy, okay. We've
so
just
I can get
given
a
you
few
free
of those
plug.
stacks out of the garage.
Then from Parkside, what?
Well, at Parkside, I was 5 years as vice chancellor there, and then the chancellor that I was working for, after my 3rd year, suddenly died of a heart attack. And so I spent a year as acting chancellor on that campus, and then the search committee did not recommend me for the position. So a new person came in who I worked with for a year to help in the transition for the administration on the campus. But then I asked to return to teaching, which had been my first love anyway, you know.
Sure.
So I spent a year on the Madison campus. They asked me to come to Madison I reestablished the debate program there. I taught a course in language and thought. I also served as a special assistant to the chancellor for the Madison campus for a year. And then I came back, after that year's leave, I came back to Parkside and taught for 2 years, teaching essentially the courses I've been teaching here at UNO.
And then we got you.
Right. I can remember a good friend of mine who was vice chancellor of the Madison campus nominated me for the position of vice chancellor. And I can remember his sending me a note because he had been vice chancellor at Madison, but then he moved to be vice chancellor at the Boulder campus of University of Colorado. And he did not have a very good experience at the University of Colorado, and when he wrote to me to tell me that he was nominating me at University of Nebraska at Omaha, that he was letting me know ahead of time that he was going back to the physics laboratory, that he was never, ever going to be an administrator again in his life.
And that didn't scare you off?
It should have scared, I should have learned something from him. He didn't scare me off on that. So I went through with the interviews for UNO. And like I was saying, there was a dramatic difference between the spirit and the attitude and the mutual respect that existed on the UNO campus compared to what I had initially been confronted with on the Wisconsin campus.
I remember those days very well because, as we've discussed before, I was, as you know very well, I was on the search committee that brought you here for that interview. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about what your first impressions are of our UNO campus when you came here? You started in doing that a little bit. Could you elaborate?
One of my first impressions, which I thought was interesting, I had been, and I think you were on the search committee for the chancellor position, but I had been on the list as one of the candidates for the chancellor position at UNO when Del Weber was selected as chancellor.
Right.
And when my friend from Wisconsin nominated me for vice chancellor, you know, I thought, I wonder if the new chancellor there, how we would work out. Whether this would be a good fit or whether this would... See, many times if you bring in people who didn't get a job that they had applied for, they sometimes engage in undermining activities and harm the development of a campus. So when I came for the interviews at Omaha, I can remember putting my head in the door. It was the door that you later occupied. It was the dean's office. That is, the chancellor gave that over to the dean of arts and sciences. Back in the
old, what we used to call the administration building, now Arts and Sciences Hall.
Right.
It was originally the president's office. When I was interviewed here, Mabel L was in that office, and then Del Weber was in that office, and then, as you said, later on it became the office of the dean of arts and sciences.
Right.
So that's the door you peeked in.
That's the door. I opened the door up and I peeked in and I saw Del Weber sitting at his desk, And I said, do you know what I know? You know, that I had been a candidate when he was named chancellor. And he looked up at me and he said, yes, I do. And I said, will that make a difference to you? And he said, you've asked the question the wrong way. I should be asking the question, will it make a difference to you? And I said, no, it wouldn't make a difference to me because I'm not that kind of person. That is the kind of person who undermines someone that he's working for. And Dell said, well, maybe we can work something out. And so I was very fortunate to be named the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UNO. And Dell and I had a very successful experience working with one another. There was hardly a crossword that passed between us for 15 years.
Yeah, and you worked together for a long time, 15 years. Yeah. So what was the campus like when you first came here back in those years?
Well, the enrollment was strong on the campus because it had been several years earlier when you were first arriving on the campus. It had been a municipal institution, but then
I came here in 1960, so that
was it 68? I think
68. We switched to the state.
So it had been on the state for 11 years by the time I arrived in 1979, and during that period of time there had been a lot of development on the campus in terms of the numbers of students and the numbers of faculty that were hired. And when I came, I retained the staff members in my office because they were so valuable people to work with.
Do you remember who some of those were? Elaine Hess?
Elaine Hess was the Associate Vice Chancellor, and John Farr was the Assistant Vice Chancellor. And they had been working for Herb Garfinkel, who was my predecessor.
Your predecessor as Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. I remember Herb well.
And from what I was able to determine, you know, looking at the materials and talking to the people, Herb Garfinkel had done a superb job of establishing higher expectations of performance for faculty and staff that were under his jurisdiction. And the tenure standards for the campus were very strong. The appointment and reappointment standards and promotion standards were strong. And I felt that I was very fortunate coming at the time I did, that I was able to say, here's something that's been done real well. I don't have to spend my time on that. I can spend
Herb
my
was
time.
a great scholar, and he turned things around a lot. I was a brand new dean when he first came here, so or he hired me as dean. So what you're saying is entirely accurate and a great credit to Herb. He did a good job.
It's something that you know, when I went to Wisconsin, I couldn't stand on the shoulders of those before me. But when I came to UNO, I could. And I think that is the way you build strength on a campus. Is, you know, if you find it strong, don't you know, they say don't fix things if they aren't broken. If something is working well, you know, let it work well and do other things that were so you can make your contribution to the campus.
Now, in the years since you first came here, you've seen a lot of changes, and you were instrumental in many of those changes yourself. Could you tell us about some of those changes that you've seen over the years?
Well, I think that the changes relate to the areas of responsibility in the academic affairs. That is, academic programs, personnel decisions, budgetary decisions. Very briefly on the budgetary front, we went through several periods of time during those 15 years that I was here where we went through major reductions in budget.
I remember those well.
Well, we used to call them reallocations because we thought that sounded better, you know. But we were always, reallocation meant cut for someone and addition for someone else. But reallocation always had, you know, some uncomfortable, you know, people because the reductions had to occur in order to engage in reallocation. We went through those with I think considerable ease when I reflect on it, because I think people were willing to work together on it and pull together and not turn it into some kind of campus, warfare. And of course, one of my objectives as Vice Chancellor was to try to build an academic community that would not engage in internecine warfare. And I used to try to say to the deans, as you will recall in some of these meetings, we're not going to take any votes in these meetings on who gets what money and who doesn't get the money. All we're going to do in these meetings is I'm going to get your advice. And I'm going to try to do the best I can to work with and follow your advice, but the decisions are going to be made by my office and by the Chancellor, because we're responsible for those decisions. And I don't want you going back to your faculty saying, I lost the vote. I want you going back to your faculty saying, I had full opportunity to give advice and counsel on how these matters should be handled. And I think that what I said was listened to and was evaluated. I won't get all the things that I asked for, because you can't get all the things you ask for. But at least, there was direct communication and open communication on those issues.
Could we maybe talk about some of the specific changes that you saw? Now, I know that you were instrumental, I know because I was involved in them too, in things like curricular reform. We had some new programs that started up, and
yes, I think the first thing that I noticed on the campus is that compared to other campuses I've been on, there was not a discrete set of university general education requirements. Now, I say discrete set because there was a general education requirement by each of the colleges.
Right.
Arts and science, business, and
in fact, in the whole University of Nebraska system, the colleges determine their own curriculum.
Yes, right. Because the colleges are the ones who certify that someone has completed a degree.
And the colleges are like arts and sciences, business administration, education. Each have its separate right.
Yes. And each of those colleges had general education requirements. Now, the extent to which you could put a template over those and find the same kinds of requirements, such as English, the same kinds of requirements by all those colleges, to that extent, there was a university requirement.
Sure.
But it wasn't identified in the catalog for students, to follow. So one of the first things I did was appoint a faculty committee to review the general education requirements and see which ones we already had in common and what additional ones we'd like to have in common. And after a year of work on that, they came in with recommendations that related to admissions, general education, and as a result of that, graduation requirements for the campus. And I remember how frustrated I was in that first go-around, because when we asked the college faculties to vote on this, and they had to vote on it because they have ultimate jurisdiction over the degrees that are granted by their college. And the vote was 3-2 against those requirements. So some people wanted me to just forget about it, but I chose to go back to the drawing board and try another approach. And ultimately, it took 10 years.
Yeah, I remember that well.
To change the general education requirements for the campus.
It was a major effort.
But for me, it was time well spent, and I think that just the fact that we have that discrete set of requirements in the catalog has given students an anchor. As they change majors, they know they've got certain courses that they've taken that continue to count.
No matter which curriculum they decide to adopt. And then there were a number of other things you did too. I know you were involved in the development of some doctoral programs here on campus.
Well, that was something after the initial failure to get the general education requirements. One of the things that the chancellor and I talked about was some kind of long-range strategic planning committee that it would have as its objective directions and priorities for the campus. And I think you might have been on that committee, Jack. There were 17 of us.
It's hard to remember back that far.
I think you were out almost every committee that's ever been on the campus of import, you know. But there were 17 people on that committee, the faculty, there was a student member, there were some community members. It was in that committee where we talked about whether we should continue to pursue general education. It was in that committee where we talked about what about doctoral education. And I must say there was not very much enthusiasm for doctoral programming on the campus.
Except for one department that I know very well.
Yes.
Psychology.
Psychology, which have already had doctoral programming under the aegis of the Lincoln campus.
Right.
And they were strong, very strong. I know you served as chair of that department for a period of time before you became dean, prior to my arrival here. So I know you were part of building that department. But this was a strong department, and they already had doctoral programming. But I thought that we needed doctoral programming in the College of Education. And in particular, I thought we needed it in the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, because that was the college that had been designated by the state strategic planning, by state planning, as the system-wide college.
Could we very quickly say what that college is? What sort of programs do they have?
The Public Affairs and Community Service has departments of gerontology, public administration, social work, and criminal justice.
Okay.
They also have the Goodrich program, which is a program for...
And their statewide responsibilities are in which areas?
Their statewide responsibilities are in criminal justice and public administration.
Yes. So those were the areas that you were thinking of for the doctoral program?
So I kind of took the position that we have statewide responsibility in these areas, so therefore we should develop doctoral programming in these areas. And ultimately, that particular committee did support that recommendation, and so we were able to develop those programs. Something I might mention briefly, in talking with Chancellor Weber, I suggested that we go to the regents and ask for the entitlement to plan for doctoral programs in what areas, so that we could up front get a decision as to whether they were going to smile on these kinds of programs or not, because I didn't want to go through all this work like we had done on general education and it loses.
Sure.
And go through all this work on doctoral programming and then have people say, well, you weren't allowed to have those from the beginning. And he bought the idea, and so we put together a proposal, and we went to the regents and said, we want the entitlement to plan. And if we do a good job of planning, you know, we don't want the question raised later on whether we were supposed to be doing any planning in these areas. And so the arguments and the confrontations that had to take place among the campuses took place at that time. And when the regents and central administration, should say central administration and the regents, when they approved our entitlements for doctoral planning, we knew then that we were on a strong path that we could go ahead and plan those degrees.
Well, just so our listening audience understands what we're talking about here, beginning a PhD program is not a simple process. Obviously, you have to have the qualified people, and you have to have students who are interested in entering the program. But you also need administrative support within the university. You have to have approval of the governing board, which in our case is the elected board of regents. You need these days to have approval of the coordinating commission on post-secondary education. I don't know whether you had to do that back in those days or not, did you?
Well, there wasn't there was a post-secondary commission, but it wasn't the same one.
Well,
as
not
they,
the same as
as
it,
they
quite
have
the same
now.
as it
And
is
the one
today.
they have now, you have to, your programming has to come up through them.
And then
for
you need the
approval.
financial support also for this
Right.
program.
Right.
So it's not a process that you can do overnight.
People were worried on the campus that if we went into doctoral programming, we would engage in major reallocations of other people's funds to those doctoral areas, and they would end up being caught in another one of these reallocations.
Yeah.
So we try to identify resources within the colleges where the doctoral programming was to be started. We tried to initiate the first funding from those areas instead of right away going to some other college and saying we're reallocating it.
Sure.
And I can remember some of those first meetings with the Department of Criminal Justice and the Department of Public Administration in particular. I can remember they were uneasy because they wanted to know whether there was sufficient support on the campus from the administration especially, to stick with them when they go through the process, because it's a long and difficult process. And you can't just develop good faculty, you really have to develop outstanding faculty. And this means you need time and money that you're willing to place in research activities as well as in the teaching and service activities. In that college, because it was the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, service activities were also areas we were expected to fund. And of course, research is one of the doctoral program. A PhD is primarily a program in research. And if you don't have a faculty that's actively involved in research...
Students have to write doctoral dissertations. We were talking about the one you wrote a little while back. So this would be true of the students in these new programs too. They'd have to do the research necessary to enable them to write a dissertation.
Right.
That's what a dissertation usually is a research project, right?
Yeah. And I can remember they're asking, is there going to be support for this kind of activity?
Right.
If we want to do research, is someone in your office going to say, well, no, you need to have X number of hours in teaching over and above, and your research is all extra, and your service is all extra, or is not part of your teaching function. And so we had to come to some understandings with them, and they were.
So it's a major project.
They're major projects, and they responded exceedingly well.
And we did get those programs in CPACs, the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, and in Educational Administration as well.
Just this past commencement, the first graduate in public administration received her PhD.
Wonderful.
And I was on that examining committee.
That must have been a very good feeling for you as you saw that.
Real good feeling.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and there are so many things that I know we haven't even touched on, but I would like maybe to get a chance to at least briefly touch on a few of them. I know that you definitely want to say something about the development of the Aviation Institute. That's another important part of the of your accomplishments over the years here.
I'll just say a few words on that.
Okay.
But one day in the office, I got a telephone call from Don Smithy, who's the director of the Eppley Airport. And he said, I have in front of me some newspaper articles about the need for pilots and administrators to work in aviation administration throughout the country, and thought I'd send them to you and see what you think about whether a program of that nature could be started at UNO. And I thought I had a good fit for that program because of my background in...
Yeah, so your Air Force experience here is coming to play.
And so this is one time when we did a lot of planning behind the scenes, I will admit. Because we were afraid that if we did all the planning in the open, someone would shoot us down before we... Oh,
now it's coming out. Okay, we're learning some secrets here today.
Right. So we did a lot of planning, working in the background, and we did this planning primarily with people like Chuck Durham,
Who had a long-time interest in aviation.
Long-time interest in aviation, and who owned a Learjet and was a pilot himself. His son was a pilot also. And we worked with Walter Scott from Peter Kiewit Construction.
So you had the Omaha
with the
movers and shakers at the time.
That's right. We worked with Mr. Harper, who was in ConAgra. In fact, I can remember the meeting where the Chancellor and several others of us sat down with Mike Harper, Chuck Durham, and Walter Scott and laid out in front of them our initial planning for an aviation institute and indicating what kind of financial support we thought we had to have, or we couldn't get anywhere with it at all, because if this were to be done on reallocation, everyone would be opposed to it.
Right.
And we'd had some experience with reallocation. And I can remember that meeting when I asked for so many million, and they said no, that wouldn't be possible, but they would do so much a year for so many years, and by then we ought to be able to be up on our feet and going. And it was a real pleasure that day when they made that commitment. And when we went to the regions and said, we're able to say, we want to do this program, but we also have this financial commitment for the program. It sailed through without any problems.
And now it's become a major program on the campus. I think we were talking a little earlier. You were telling me that it's about to celebrate its 10th anniversary as a program on the campus.
Just today, as I was walking over to the television studio, I ran into Brent Bowen, who is the director of the Aviation Institute, and he said, Otto, we're planning our 10-year celebration. And I, of course, said, where'd those 10 years go to? And it went by rather quickly. The first director of the Aviation Institute was a special character.
I remember him well.
Bill Shea.
Yes.
And anytime he was on campus, or anytime he visits campus, which is every now and then, everybody knows he's there.
That's right.
Because he cuts a swath through the campus.
He was a good person to have as the first director of that program.
Excellent person to have.
A lot of
the only problem we had with Bill Shea is he only stayed for 2 years.
Right.
And that's because he's always in demand in other kinds of positions and roles. And
but we were fortunate in getting Brent Bowen, who you just mentioned, as a successor, and
Brent has
had a great influence on that.
He's had a great influence on the program.
Well, there's so many things we could talk about. For example, one of the really major things that went on in the campus during your tenure was in international studies with the war in Afghanistan, and we were a major player in some of the
well, I know
relief work and so on there.
You'd had the opportunity to travel to Afghanistan prior to the revolution there.
Right. And during your tenure here, there was the faculty organized as a union. I presume you've got lots of stories about that to tell too. But unfortunately, we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left here. So
I could tell a Paul Borghi story about that.
Go ahead and do that.
When that first year I was on campus, that summer is when people were deciding whether they were going to vote for or against the union. And I ran across Paul Borghi, who I had known because we were from speech communication.
Right.
And I had known Paul, and I said, Paul, how are you going to vote on the union? And Paul said, I'm voting for the union. I knew when Paul Borghi said he was voting for the union was going to pass. But I asked him, why, Paul? You don't really think that they're going to give us more money than they give to the medical center and to the Lincoln campus? He said, no, I don't really think they'll give us more money, but I think I'll get more of what they give to the campus. And he was absolutely right, because the negotiations that we went through eventually allowed for more of the increased dollars to go across the board, as opposed to more limited numbers of faculty. And so Paul ended up, he was right. He ended up getting more money than he was getting before because of this across-the-board phenomenon in unionization. But we had a lot of exciting moments. We had a period of time when campus was picketed on Dodge Street. I can remember going out and taking pictures of the...
I remember that picture you had in your office
Right.
for many years there.
Right.
The picture of the, what did they call them? The
Save the 21.
Save the 21, yes. The
Right.
UNO, there was a, it was claimed that 21 faculty members would be fired if...
Right. And when we first started our planning, there probably would have been 21. But we were able to plan and fight long enough that vacant positions occurred, and out of that entire list of 21, there was only one person that ended up losing his position.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left here. We've been talking about a number of people as we've gone along. You started in with talking about your relationship with Del Weber, for example, and you've mentioned other people as we've talked. In the last couple minutes that we have, could you think of any other personalities on the faculty or administration or you know, any the service facilities, anything that are particularly memorable that you'd like to mention before we wind this up?
Jack, there are so many people. You're one of them.
Oh, thank you.
There are so many people that I could talk about. The deans that we've had, faculty members who have been particularly interesting and noteworthy. There's a long list of all of these items. How much time do we have?
A couple minutes.
A couple minutes. Chancellor Weber was a real joy to work with, and over those 15 years we had many good times. You know, his reputation for not being as good a driver as he could be.
I've heard lots of these stories, but tell us one.
Well, one, I remember
I know Del gets a good laugh at himself on some of these too.
we drove to northeast Missouri, which is now Truman State University.
Yeah.
We drove there to study their testing program for students. We drove there in winter weather. Regent Kermit Hansen was in the car, and Hugh Cowden, and I was in the car, and Chancellor Weber. And how we made it over and back is a clear miracle. He starts down the slippery road and says, I'm going to test my brakes to see how they work, and he stomps on the brakes. We almost went into a spin when we first started out, but he recovered. We also passed a car on the road one time when another vehicle was just turning onto the highway, and it was all snow and slippery. I don't know how all three of us passed, but somehow...
But you somehow arrived back safe and sound.
Somehow we passed. And while we were driving back, I remember leaning over to Del and saying, those double yellow line, isn't that supposed to be on the left of us?
And it was on the right?
It was on the right of us. He turned over so it was on the left of us, and the car went by. And Kermit Hansen said, I'm driving. So the Regent got behind the wheel.
I wish we could go through more of these stories, but I'm just getting a signal that our time's up here. So I really appreciate, Otto, that you're taking time to visit with us today. And I should mention that this is, I didn't mention earlier on, but this is what we're talking now in the winter of the year 2000, the new millennium. And it's January of that year, so just so we have a date on this. And I really thank you very much for being a guest here. And to our audience, I thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Otto Bauer, Professor of Communication and longtime Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UNO. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the people who made that history, the history makers. And this is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.